Hey fellow knitters, welcome to my colorwork series. In this video I'm going to show you how to add and change colors while also or simultaneously dealing with the tails. So for example, here's a tail here from this ball that I just cut off. So in this demonstration I am going to be using Noro Kureyon. This is one of my favorite wools to use. This comes in dozens of variegated patterns that cover the entire spectrum, color spectrum, which is really nice. So I'm using, the pattern that I'm using is the Lizard Ridge Afghan. This can be found at the Ravelry site. But what I wanted to show you, and technically this is a form of stripe work, even though you've got these ridges or these humps. And the reason for that is because after doing 3 long rows or normal rows that span your needle, you start doing short rows, and short rows are where you are only knitting partway across your needle, wrapping your yarn and turning, and then knitting back. So that's what's going on here. But the reason why I'm using this as a demonstration is a few reasons. Number one, technically it is stripe work, but for this pattern, the actual pattern calls for you to use the beginning of the yarn and then the end of the yarn, because the color actually doesn't repeat. It goes from one spectrum to the other. I like to use 2 separate balls for an increase in contrast. So as you can see here, we've got a ridge that has 3 humps to it, and then if you notice in this section there's a ridge that has 3 humps to it. So that's one pattern that you repeat every other section. And then the middle ones, you've got these 2 humps here. That's a separate pattern that, again, you repeat every other section. And that's how the ridges lock in to one another. So as you can see here, I'm working with 2 different variegated patterns. So I've got this really dark blue that has actually merged into a dark green. And as you can see from this ball here, this is where I left off. And so this is where I'm going to pick up with. So this ball I just cut away, which was this one right here, and I will use that when I get back after completing this next section. Now the reason why this procedure or this process works is because the first 3 rows are knitted in long row style. So in other words, all the way directly across the needle for the first 3 rows, and so we're able to do this process. The second reason I'm doing this process, because many of you are wondering, well, why don't you just carry the yarn, the non-working yarn, up the side of the section that you're currently knitting. And actually the pattern does call for you to do that. The reason why I don't like doing that, or keeping 2 balls attached to my work at any given point, is because you're doing so many short rows, which again calls for you to wrap and turn your work. And when you're constantly wrapping and turning your work, the 2 attached balls can actually become tangled or twisted around one another. So I don't like using that method. But this method is actually a really great method to use. It's a very easy method to use, because many of you are also asking, well, what about all the tails? And that is true, because there's 8 different sections. If you were to do this process without dealing with the tails, you would actually have 14 tails to weave in, and of course nobody likes to weave in ends. Okay, so the first thing that you do is you want to establish a tail. So you want to, I like to use 6 to 8 inches. So that's about 6 to 8 inches. And that will be for the tail for this yarn that I'm getting ready, or this wool that I'm getting ready to attach. And it's very, very easy to attach. You just go into the first stitch, and then you loop the new working yarn around the needle, and then you pull it through, and then slip it off. Now if you notice this stitch here, this pink stitch is kind of elongated. If you just give the pink tail a little tug, that will compensate for that. And if it still is a little loose when you come back after completing row 2, again I'll show you how to take care of that. Now the first thing you want to do is you want to separate your tail from your working yarn. And I wanted to let you know, by default I am a continental knitter, but for this process I do actually like to use English style, because it's easier for me to hold the tail that way. So what you're going to do is you're going to take the tail, and then you're going to lay the tail, let me get the needle into the second stitch here. You go into the second stitch first, And then you take, and I grip my tail with my pinky and ring finger like this, and then I use my index finger to actually maneuver the yarn across the needle, the right needle. So again, you're going to take the tail, which I'm holding in my left hand, and you're going to swing it over the right needle. And then you're going to take your working yarn in your right hand, and then you're going to go around the needle as if to knit. Now, you do want to, the next thing you want to do is you want to take the tail and swing it out of the way, or swing it up and over that needle. Okay, so again, we originally laid it over the needle. So now that we've used the working yarn to put into the knit position, we want to swing that over. And the reason for that is if you don't swing the tail out of the way and you complete that knit stitch as I just did, you'll actually be pulling the working yarn and the tail through this bottom stitch, in effect increasing your stitches, and you don't want to do that. Okay, so the third stitch, I'm just going to knit as usual. And then the fourth stitch, again, I'm going to lay the tail across the needle, and then I'm going to take the working yarn, wrap it around under the needle, and then swing the tail out of the way to complete that stitch. Okay. So the next stitch, which is stitch 5, we're going to knit as normal. And then stitch 6, again, you're going to lay the tail over the needle, the right needle, take your working yarn, and then swing it under the needle, and then swing the tail out of the way. Now, if you don't swing the tail out of the way, as you can see, I've just knitted the tail and the working yarn through that stitch, and that's not what we want to do. So again, just simply make sure it's out of the way, and then complete the stitch. And then stitch 7 is just normally knitted. And for this first row, if you're kind of picking up, we're carrying the tail every other stitch, and that stitch is an even stitch, an even numbered stitch. And the other thing too is, for those who are familiar with Fair Isle knitting, this is exactly how you catch a float, or when you catch floats, when you're working with 2 yarns. But so now we're on, let's see, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now we're on stitch 8, which is an even stitch, so we have to lay the tail over the needle, and then the yarn goes under, and then swing the tail out of the way and finish the stitch. And then knit stitch 9 as normal, and then finally stitch 10, take the tail over your needle, take your working yarn, wrap it around and under, swing your tail out of the way. And so as you can see, I've carried that tail 10 stitches because it's 10 stitches in. And now what I'm going to do is just continue to knit all the way down the needle. And actually what I do at this point is I switch to continental because that is faster and easier for me to knit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to knit all the way down, and I'm going to turn my work, and when I come back I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so I finished row 1 and I've turned my work, and of course this is the stockinet stitch, so what I'm going to simply do is just purl back in the opposite direction. Just purl as you normally would with the stockinet stitch. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'm going to come back and show you what to do for that last stitch, because it's a little bit different than what you would normally think to do. Okay, so I'm coming up on the last few stitches, and actually I'm getting ready to pass the first tail that we wove in. And I like to do about 9 to 10 stitches when I weave in my ends like this. And then the nice thing is because this is wool and the fibers, they really cling and lock into each other, and so there's no way that this tail is going to come out or come undone. And you can also do this with acrylic yarns, any type of yarn you can do this process with. Alright, so I'm coming up to the last 2 stitches. Now, This next stitch here, which is of course the last stitch, I'm going to do something a little bit different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tail, the pink tail that was from the old ball, and I'm going to make sure that it's pulled snug. And of course we pulled it snug the first go around. And again, because it's wool, it kind of stayed in that position. But if you're doing acrylic, you might have to, or find that you have to give it another tug again. So what we're doing now is we are purling both the tail and the working yarn through that last stitch. And of course you're asking, well, you've just increased your stitches. Well, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to take the pink one and pull it out. And in effect what we've done is we have carried that tail up one row. And the reason why that's important is because now we're going to work the tail similarly to the way we did the first tail. So I'm going to grab the tail with my ring and pinky and ring finger. And then for the first stitch, I'm going to lay it over the needle. And then I'm going to take the working yarn and wrap it around the needle and then move that tail out of the way, just like we did on row 1, because this is row 3 right now. So that was the first stitch. The second stitch is just going to be knitted as normal. And then the third stitch, we're going to take the tail, lay it over the right needle, and take your working yarn and go under. Swing your tail out of the way and complete the stitch. And then stitch 4, knitted as usual. So what you're seeing is for this third row, we're doing the odd numbered stitches in which to carry your tail along. Remember, the row 1 we used the even. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is stitch 8. Just knitted as normal. Stitch 9. Lay the tail over the right needle. Take your working yarn under and then flip this over. And then stitch 10. And so again, I just weave in for that second tail 9 stitches. And then of course I switch back to my continental and then just knit all the way down. So this is row 3, and you do need, if you have 2 tails like that, you will need at least 3 rows to knit both of them in. Some people I've even seen weave both tails in at the same time rather than, and you certainly can do that, but it will bulk up this row right here. And as you can see, when you turn your work over, you can see where we've woven in the green, and then here we've just woven in the pink. And of course you can see it where we've done that here, here, and here for each change. And actually I have a square that I've already finished that has been blocked. So if you notice, this is all kind of scrunched up, but once you block it, it lays perfectly flat. And then if you flip it over to the other side, you can see exactly where we did the color change and we wove in the ends. So that's a nice little trick for color work in which you are switching colors. You can obviously do this on normal striped work versus this variation of stripe work. Technically it's still stripes, it's just they're wavy stripes. So that is how you change colors and weave in your ends simultaneously, which will save you a lot of time and possibly headaches after you finish your whatever it is, your project you're working on. So thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. Please do subscribe to my channel. Also, please do provide comments and feedback. I do appreciate them and I always respond to them. So thank you again for watching.